Hello everyone, so today I'm going to be talking about all the manga I read in October. It was spooky month, so primarily these are horror or horror adjacent manga. I also included anything to do with like paranormal, supernatural, mystery thriller type stuff. Any of that I threw into the same kind of thing. So that's what I read this month. And I enjoyed most of the things I read. It was kind of a mixed bag this month, but that's to be expected when you're reading horror manga. It's very subjective. But actually the first thing I read in the month was a reread, and that was all 17 volumes of Ajin. Now, I've read the first half of the series 3 times, I think. 3 or 4 times, but this was the second time that I read the entire thing all the way through. Now, I do actually think this manga has a little bit of a rough start. If you'll see on the front, there are 2 names here. One is the author, one is the artist, but pretty soon after it started serializing, the main author left the story. I'm not sure why, they didn't work on it anymore, and then the artist became the main author as well. And so I think the first couple volumes are just a tiny bit rough, but once it hits volume 3 or 4 or 5, then it really hits its stride. And the art even very quickly starts to improve, which is pretty impressive considering that, again, the artist became the author, so he suddenly had to take up this whole entire work project that he wasn't really planning on. But by far, my favorite aspect of this manga, and I've said it many, many times, is the antagonist. One of the most interesting and genuinely scary antagonists I've ever read about. He always leaves you guessing. You really have no idea what his next plan of attack is going to be, and I really enjoyed that. I guess I didn't give a synopsis. Basically, this is about a boy named Kay. One day after school, he gets hit by a truck and he dies, but then he comes back to life as this demi-human. And in this case, many demi-humans are sought after by the government because they want to use them in experiments or stuff like that. So he basically goes on the run, goes into hiding from people and the government. And the infamous antagonist of the series is another demi-human, and it's very interesting to see his motivations for why he is against the government, stuff like that. I don't want to give it away too much, but I definitely enjoyed those aspects. I also really enjoyed the protagonist. I think these two have a very interesting back and forth. One of them has been a demi-human for a long time. He knows the best ways to use that to his advantage, whereas Kay has recently become a demi-human. Well, technically they're always demi-humans, but he's recently realized that he's a demi-human. So him and a bunch of other people are trying to out-strategize this really scary individual, and it just makes for a really enjoyable read. The art definitely gets amazing very quickly. The action scenes are so clear, it almost feels like I'm watching a movie, and obviously I really enjoy that. Sometimes I'll read manga series where the action scenes are not very clear. It's hard to tell what's happening. That is not the case here. It is very, very clear and easy to read. The last couple volumes are so thrilling and fun to read. It's almost impossible to stop. The last time I read the series, I read the final 5 volumes just in one sitting, and I did the same thing this time. I do think there were just a couple different plot points at the end of the manga that didn't get wrapped up quite as much as I would have liked them to. They didn't get addressed as much as I would have liked them to, but that didn't really affect my enjoyment of the series. It is still one of my favorite manga. I don't really do a top 5, top 10, top 20 favorite series list. I don't know those off the top of my head, but this is definitely up there, so highly recommend this one if it sounds interesting to you. Next, I read The Book of Human Insects by Osamu Tezuka, and I went into this knowing absolutely nothing about it. I just knew that it was by Osamu Tezuka, and I assumed it was more horror just because of the title. The Book of Human Insects sounds pretty disgusting, so I thought it was going to be more like that, but I had no idea what this was actually about. But I'll tell you, this is about a woman who is basically a genius. She can pretty much mimic perfectly the talents of people. So at first she was an actress, and she copied the talents of another actress that she enjoyed and basically became that person and kind of pushed the actress out, and she became a famous actress. She's done the same thing with an architect. And here we follow her trying to become an author and kind of the plagiarism and different things that she does to get ahead. But because she's taken advantage of so many people, she has a lot of enemies and people who really have a lot of hate for her. And they're out for revenge, and that's what this follows. I really enjoyed the themes in this manga. It explores a lot of the main character's childhood and what possesses her to do these things, why she wants to take advantage of so many people. And it also portrays a lot of the terrible terrible, inhumane things that people will do to get ahead, to be successful, to get money, power, fame, everything like that. If you've read some of Osamu Tezuka's thriller works, I've only read a couple, but they all seem to have a lot of sensitive subject matter, so if that's going to bother you, I wouldn't read this, but I highly enjoyed this. Again, I didn't know anything about it when I started it, and I was very, very surprised by it, but definitely one I will remember and reread in the future. Next, I read some volume 2s. So I've been doing try-a-volume videos where I read the first volumes of different manga series, and recently a couple of the second volumes of the series came out, so I read a bunch of them, or a couple of them that I'm going to talk about in this video. The first one is The Valiant Must Fall Volume 2. If you watched my unhaul, you already know that I'm unhauling this series. This is just a very, very heavily historical manga, and there are a bunch of little footnotes in the margins and at the end that gives context for the historical setting, but I just don't care to read those. It really takes me out of the story to stop reading, read the footnote, and continue on, or even have to flip in the back to get some more context for what's going on. And a lot of the time, the footnotes don't seem to add anything interesting. It just seems to add a tiny bit of background, but it doesn't seem relevant to the actual story. Like, for example, they'll mention a historical figure just in passing, and then there'll be a footnote explaining who that historical figure is, but it really doesn't matter to these characters and the situation they're in. Kind of adjacent to that, there's some what I would describe as weird translation decisions. There's one part where there's a speech bubble that says the person just came back from Yomi no Kuni, which means the land of the dead, but instead of just saying the land of the dead, they wrote Yomi no Kuni and then had a footnote saying that's the land of the dead, which in my opinion just comes off as incredibly unprofessional. I don't see the advantage to leaving that untranslated in that speech bubble. So it's just very distracting, and I didn't enjoy those aspects, obviously. The immortality aspect of this manga is interesting enough, but it is not enough to hold my attention over all of these other aspects that I'm not enjoying or that are distracting. So I'm going to go ahead and drop the series and unhaul it, as I already mentioned. So that's enough of this. Speaking of series not for me, promise I'm not going to go on about this for too long, but I read the second volume, the second omnibus of Homunculus, and did not like it is an understatement. When I read the first volume, I mentioned that I thought the main premise could become repetitive. It wasn't the most unique thing I've ever read, and it seemed like it could become a little bit preachy, which is definitely the case for Omnibus 2, and that is not even what my main complaint about Omnibus 2 is. But I just want to say that all of the things that I did think could happen definitely happened in the second volume. If you remember at the end of the first volume, there's a little bit of a suggestion or foreshadowing or whatever, or setting up of a situation where the men or the main characters in the series are going to take advantage of a teenage girl. And that definitely happens in the second omnibus. It is very graphic. It goes on for 80% of the volume, and I don't even think I'm exaggerating. It goes on for so long, and it is incredibly uncomfortable, just terrible to read. The end of the second omnibus does seem to be moving past that and more into what the first omnibus explored, but that was just so terrible to read that I had to stop. Not only that, but in this manga, there's like a metaphor of the monsters inside us and what happens if we could see what other people are hiding, basically. And this metaphor in the second omnibus of what this teenage girl character represents is so heavy-handed. It really makes me feel like the author thinks the reader is stupid and won't understand the metaphor they're trying to portray. So they just keep repeating the same thing over and over again, and it's really hard to talk about this without spoiling things. And I'm trying to be vague, but also explain why I don't like this. But the metaphor is just so heavy-handed. It really felt like it could reach out of the page and slap you across the face. That's how heavy-handed it was. And yeah, so even completely ignoring just how graphic the first 80% of the omnibus is, the story or the message that the author is trying to portray is awful and not enjoyable, not even scary in an interesting way. It's just gross and terrible. I really feel like this completely ruined the kind of interesting parts that was built in the first omnibus, and it's just bad. So I unhauled this. I will not be continuing with it. I don't know if this author's done anything else, but no interest in reading anything else by this author just because of that. Yeah, hopefully that made sense even though I couldn't really talk about spoilers. Hopefully I got my criticism across, but I would highly, highly not recommend this manga. Moving quickly on, let's talk about something I can highly recommend. I next read The Summer Hikaru Died, Volume 2. So I'm not going to talk about this too much other than to say I'm very much enjoying it, but I do kind of want to mention a little thing I noticed. You probably already know what this is about, but this is about a boy whose friend goes up into a mountain, disappears, and then comes back, but he's not the same. And this character is pretty much the only one who notices because he is best friends with this character. He's been friends with him for a long time, and he knows that he's different, but nobody else really knows. This manga has a great creepy atmosphere. I've said this before, but rural Japan makes for a great setting for horror manga. I've heard people say that this is a BL manga. I wouldn't describe it as a BL manga. This character is he definitely has feelings for his best friend, but I don't think it's a BL manga, at least so far. But this volume definitely makes a connection between the Hikaru character, who is different from everyone else in this village because he is different, because he's not Hikaru, he is something else, and the main character here, who is gay, or that's what I'm assuming, they don't use that word, but he also feels isolated and different from everyone else in the village because he has these feelings and no one around him approves of them, or they don't know that he feels this way. He has to hide it. Also, there's a part in this volume that actually creeps me out a lot, and obviously I always enjoy when I get to experience that when reading a manga. It doesn't happen very often, and I'm very much looking forward to the next volume. I'm loving the series. Even though there's only 2 volumes out so far, it's already one of my favorite horror manga. So if you like horror manga, then highly recommend this one as well. The next manga I read in October was Portus. I'm just going to go over this very quickly. This is a reread. I don't know why I held on to it when I first read it because I didn't like it then, and I felt pretty much the same way this time. The pacing is not very good. I think that's my main complaint about it, is it just goes way too fast. It does have an interesting story, but it just wasn't explored as deeply as it could have been because it is just a single volume. I think even having just one other volume would have fleshed everything out. It would have been a lot more of an interesting experience. Also, I noticed, and I'm not sure if this is only the case for the Viz version or if it is just that way when it was released in Japan, but there is one panel especially that is censored, like heavily censored, and I don't know why because this manga is pretty graphic, so there didn't seem to be any reason for this one panel to be censored when everything else wasn't, but that was weird. And again, it could be the way it was drawn, but I don't think so. I don't know why it was like that. But just not a great manga. Sometimes things are out of print for a reason, and I believe that's the case with this manga. I don't think it was very good. So I did unhaul that one finally after many years of it being on my shelves for no reason. I also started a digital manga. I don't know if I'm going to finish it, but I started Kasane. This is about a girl who is kind of deformed. She has a facial deformity, and she's trying to follow her mother's footsteps. Her mother was a very famous actress, and she also wants to do that, but because of her facial deformity, she really isn't allowed to be an actress. But her mom left her a tube of lipstick, which allows her to, if she kisses someone, she takes their face, basically. They swap faces. And so she's using that to her advantage, kind of like the Book of Human Insects. I definitely noticed a little bit of a correlation there, but she uses that to her advantage to become the actress that she wants to be. So I only read 2 volumes of this, and I do have all 14 volumes available digitally, so I can definitely continue it, but I didn't love the first 2 volumes. I just don't think I can fully enjoy manga about acting for some reason. It kind of reminds me of Oshi no Ko, and I didn't like the acting aspects of Oshi no Ko. That's why I dropped that series. It is very interesting to read about a main character who is not really a good person. She takes advantage of people. I did like those parts because you don't see that very often in manga. And I do like reading an unlikable character every now and then. And I did notice, I'm not sure if this was even intentional, but I did notice that there are some references to various like fairy tale characters. So the first volume definitely had some Cinderella aspects, and the second volume definitely had some Sleeping Beauty aspects. If you didn't know, these original fairy tales are very dark, so I think that definitely added to the ambiance and atmosphere of this manga, but I wouldn't say I love the first 2 volumes. Again, I might continue reading just because I have the volumes available, so I might as well, even just to see where it goes from here, how many people this character is going to take advantage of, how she's going to get what she wants, and how her relationship with her mother is going to go, because her mother has passed away, but I think the relationship between her and her mother can definitely be explored more, so I might read it more just for that, and I should because I own it. So the next manga I read in October was Betwixt. This is a horror manga anthology, and this is a set of 6 short stories. 3 of them are by Japanese mangaka and 3 of them are by American authors. This is a Viz Media original, so I'm pretty sure this is the only version of this manga out. But this is an anthology basically focused on the theme of between. That's where the title comes from. And it's whatever the authors wanted to do with that prompt. And so a lot of these are about being between life and death, or being between, like, there's lots of mirrors, so who your mirror self is, stuff like that. And the physical reading experience matches that theme as well, because you start by reading 3 of the stories like this, and then once you get to the other version or language or section, then you flip it over and start reading the other way, since, again, 3 of them are from American authors and 3 of them are from Japanese authors. So I thought that was interesting, and it's been a while since I read an anthology where all of the stories were pretty successful. There were a few of these that genuinely creeped me out, and I liked all of them. I think 2 of the Japanese authors I've read from before, 1 of them I haven't. Also, I just have to mention, because I've seen some false information, this is not a Junji Ito manga. Junji Ito did the cover of this manga, but he didn't do any stories in here, so it's just basically for marketing. But I really liked all the stories in here, so overall I would say if you like horror manga, go ahead and pick this one up, give it a try. I enjoyed it a lot. The next manga I read in October was all 11 volumes of For the Kid I Saw in My Dreams. I had not read any of this before. I completely read the entire thing this month. I picked it up because it's by the same author as Erased, and I enjoyed Erased. I also read Island in a Puddle, which is also by the same author, and I did not like that one. And this one definitely followed that one in that I did not like this one very much. But this is about a guy who, when he was 5 years old, his entire family was murdered. Now he is 18 and he's looking for revenge. He's trying to find the person who murdered his family. So I think that's a pretty simple premise. It's not the most unique thing in the world, and it doesn't have to be, but I don't think this manga does a great job at what it's trying to do, which is be a mystery manga. My problem a lot of the time with mystery thriller manga, books, anything, is that once the answers are revealed, it stops being interesting. Once we start learning things, I lose interest a lot. And in this case, there are 11 volumes, and once you get to volume 7, pretty much all of the questions you have been answered, and it's just seeing the confrontations, the ramifications of decisions being made, and in my opinion, it wasn't that interesting at that point. Also, I thought the development of the main character was interesting enough, but it was also very quick, and I thought that was a pretty big problem with this manga, is the pacing. Sometimes it's way too fast, sometimes it's way too slow, and things are explored way too slowly. So all that, combined with the fact that I thought the main confrontation at the end was lackluster and not satisfying, and there's also some very questionable relationships in here in terms of like underage characters, stuff like that. Not an enjoyable manga for me. Definitely disappointment. I think the author of this is writing a new manga that's like a historical samurai manga. I might be wrong about that, but I think it's a historical manga, so a little bit different from the usual thriller manga that he has written. So I will look into that, and if it gets released over here. But I'm definitely unhauling this one. No interest in reading this again. I almost didn't even finish it, but I did because I had all the volumes. But I wouldn't recommend this one personally. And the final volume I'm going to talk about in this video is Wonder House of Horrors. This is a one-shot manga by Miyako Kojima, and I don't know if she has any other horror manga out in English. I know she's a pretty prolific horror manga author, especially in the shoujo demographic. This is a shoujo horror manga, which I just wanted to mention because sometimes there's this belief that there's no horror manga in shoujo, which is not true. Some Junji Ito manga are shoujo manga, but anyway. But this is basically a horror comedy manga. It's a short story collection. It's filled with death and gore and dismemberment and chocolate for some reason. The stories in here were interesting enough. There's a lot of characters who would be described as ugly and they're filled with envy. So you're kind of exploring those themes. I would say the first couple chapters are a little bit more darker, and then once you get towards the second half of the volume, then it becomes more comedy. But I think the most interesting part of this volume in particular is the author's note at the end. And I really appreciate indie publishers like this for adding author's notes. This author's note was added for this English release, I believe. It's dated 2023, but it adds a lot of context into the historical presence of the horror genre in manga. It talks about some horror manga booms in Japan and some pretty famous authors, but it also talks about some historical events that affected the publication of horror manga in Japan. Basically, they're at a time, and I think pretty much now, there are no horror manga magazines. So it basically explains the fall of the horror genre in Japan and how there's really no respect for the horror genre in the manga industry anymore. There's, again, no magazines that publish it, at least exclusively. And anyway, as someone who enjoys horror manga as much as I do, that was a very interesting author's note because I didn't know any of that context at all, and I always love learning new things. So definitely a pretty good horror manga, and I'm glad I picked it up. And I'll be looking into more horror manga releases by this publisher because if they're going to add more context like that, I definitely want to read them. So happy to have this one as well. So that was everything I read in October, with the exception of a couple first volumes, which I promise my next video will be that tri-volume video that I keep talking about, and you'll see me talk about Dracula and Cat-Eyed Boy and a couple other horror manga releases along with some other stuff. So look forward to that for sure, but that's going to be it for this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye!